1. Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodale. Nohema Graber was a 66-year-old Spanish teacher at Fairfield High School, a mother of 3 and a former airline pilot who rebuilt her life around language, community, and faith. In class, she was steady and encouraging, firm about effort, but generous with help. After school, she walked Chautauqua Park, a quiet routine in a small Iowa town where familiarity felt like safety. That calm presence, that predictable walk in that public place became the setting of a crime that shook the community. Among her students were 2 16-year-olds, Willard Noble, Chaden Miller, and Jeremy Everett Goodale. On the surface, they were ordinary teens juggling classes and friendships. Beneath that, prosecutors later said, a grievance took hold in Miller. He believed a disappointing Spanish grade threatened his academic standing. What should have been a classroom disagreement hardened into fixation. Messages show the idea did not stay private. Goodale, a friend and classmate, joined the planning and, tragically, the act. The psychological picture was not of a sudden snap, it was escalation. There were adolescent impulses and peer influence, but also deliberate steps. Talking about harming the teacher, choosing her daily route, bringing a weapon, believing they could avoid consequences. Courts later weighed youth factors, yet the record showed purpose. A perceived academic slight metastasized into a targeted plan to punish a teacher who was doing her job. On a November afternoon in the year 2021, Graber drove to the park she loved and started her familiar walk. There she was ambushed. A baseball bat was used as a weapon. Afterward, her body was moved and hidden beneath a tarp railroad ties and a wheelbarrow near the tracks. These are stark, non-graphic facts, included to show calculation, not to sensationalize. This was not a spontaneous fight. It was an attack staged where routine made her vulnerable, followed by an attempt to delay discovery. The concealment failed quickly. That day, authorities found her remains. What followed was a 21st century investigation shaped by digital traces. Friends and classmates shared messages in which Goodale described the act and the concealment. Additional communications tied Miller to motive and planning. Interviews, surveillance, and physical evidence from the park formed a tight timeline. Within days, both teens were arrested and charged as adults. The legal outcome was decisive. In the year 2023, Miller and Goodale each pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. Judges considered their age, the planning involved, and the profound harm to Graber's family and the town. Miller, identified as the initiator driven by the disputed grade, received life in prison with the possibility of parole after 35 years. Goodale, who cooperated with authorities and agreed to testify, if needed, received life with the possibility of parole after 25 years. In court, both apologized. Graber's loved ones delivered measured but devastating statements about the empty place at family gatherings and the loss of a teacher who bridged cultures with patience and grace. What explains such a choice? The clearest reading is retaliation for a perceived academic injury amplified by adolescent anger and reinforced by peer alignment. There was no public clinical finding that diminishes responsibility. If anything, the boasting and granular descriptions in messages pointed to agency, not delusion. Developmental context may inform sentencing, but it cannot excuse taking a life. The public response was firm. Educators and parents spoke about trust, the sanctity of schools, and the duty to protect those who teach. Candles were lit, prayers were said, and colleagues remembered a woman who once navigated the skies and later chose classrooms believing in what language can unlock. This story ends with condemnation and resolve. 2 teenagers turned grievance into violence and shattered a covenant between students and teachers. The sentences enforce accountability and, in the far distance, allow supervised review. But justice begins with remembrance, saying Nohema Graber's name, honoring her service, and recommitting to the safety and dignity of educators everywhere. No anger, no wounded pride, no bravado can ever justify the killing of a teacher. 2. Jose Reyes. Jose Horatio Reyes was a 12-year-old 7th grade student at Sparks Middle School in Nevada. Classmates and the teachers knew him as quiet and often withdrawn a boy who kept close to a small circle of peers. At home, his family ran a neighborhood restaurant and tried to build stability after moves between states. In the classroom, he did not stand out for trouble or achievement, but for a reserved demeanor that in hindsight worried some observers. The teacher he would later target was Michael Lansbury, a 45-year-old math teacher, former Marine and coach, widely admired for calm authority and care for students. In the months before the attack, investigators later found signs of emotional turmoil. Police said Reyes left writings that expressed anger over feeling mistreated at school and a desire for revenge. Other notes to his parents complicated that picture by downplaying bullying and denying that video games were the cause. Family members and reports also referenced depression, suggesting a mix of grievance and mental health struggles. None of these factors excuse what followed, but they outline a troubling inner world in a child who had access to a firearm at home. On the morning of Monday, October 21, 2013, before the first bell, Reyes arrived at the schoolyard. As students gathered near the basketball courts, he produced a handgun and opened fire. 2 classmates were wounded in the chaos. Hearing the shots, Michael Lansbury moved toward the danger, trying to talk the boy down and buying seconds for others to escape. The teacher's effort to shield children was his last act. After firing again and fleeing students and toward another teacher, the young gunman turned the weapon on himself on the playground. The investigation unfolded quickly. Officers secured the campus, gathered shell casings and video, and interviewed dozens of witnesses who had run for cover moments earlier. Detectives traced the weapon to Reyes's home and collected the notes he had left behind, which described resentment, humiliation, and a decision to end his life as part of the attack. Because the perpetrator died at the scene, there was no arrest or trial. Even so, law enforcement released a detailed report the following spring to answer public questions about motive, method, and timeline. The community's response centered on grief and on the teacher who had run toward danger. Michael Lansbury's colleagues and students remembered a steady mentor who coached sports, taught math, and modeled service learned in the Marines and the Air National Guard. News outlets and officials called him a hero for confronting the shooter and giving children time to escape. Vigils, memorials, and tributes followed in Sparks and across Nevada as the district grappled with trauma and the question of how to prevent the next tragedy. What do the facts suggest about the boy's psychology? The writings indicate a blend of anger, perceived bullying, and despair filtered through adolescent thinking that magnified slights and narrowed options to a single violent script. Investigators noted depressive symptoms. Friends described a quiet student who felt targeted. Experts often warn that such internal storms can intensify when a young person fixates on retaliation and has ready access to a gun. Here are the notes, the planning, and the final act point less to sudden rage than to a tragic, deliberate sequence. The story must end with moral clarity. A teacher devoted to his students lost his life trying to protect them. 2 children were wounded and a school community was changed forever. Explanations about bullying or depression can help adults spot risk and intervene earlier, but they do not soften accountability for choosing violence. The lesson is stark, and necessary schools must be sanctuaries. Grievances must be addressed with empathy, counseling, and safety planning, and access to deadly means must be tightly controlled. Remember Michael Lansbury for his courage, condemn the attack for what it was, a devastating betrayal of a community's trust, and honor the victims by strengthening the systems that keep children and educators safe. 3. Philip D. Chism. Philip D. Chism was a 14-year-old freshman at Danvers High School, newly arrived in Massachusetts after a family move from Tennessee. Classmates remembered a quiet student who kept to himself, sketching in notebooks and speaking softly in class. The teacher he would later target was Colleen Ritzer, a 24-year-old math teacher, in only her second year, known for patience humor and a genuine belief that kindness belongs in every lesson. She was deeply rooted in her community and loved by students who saw her as steady and encouraging. In the months leading up to the crime, fragments of a troubled inner world began to surface. A police affidavit later indicated that Chism was sensitive about the recent move and his parents' divorce. A classroom mention of Tennessee reportedly upset him. At trial, his attorneys argued he suffered from mental illness and pushed to introduce brain scan evidence to support that claim. Judges permitted mental health testimony, but applying rules of evidence limited certain expert claims. None of this explains or excuses what he chose to do, but it outlines a volatile mix of displacement, adolescent isolation, and alleged psychiatric struggle. After classes on Tuesday, October 22, 2013, Ritzer stayed to help students. Chism remained at school, followed her into a women's restroom, and attacked. Prosecutors said he used a box cutter, then moved her body with a recycling bin to the wooded edge of the campus. Surveillance cameras captured him pulling the bin through the corridors. Later evidence showed he used her credit card. The precise injuries are not described here, but the method and sequence reveal calculation rather than a spontaneous outburst. In a police interview afterward, he allegedly said, "I became the teacher," a remark the judge later excluded from trial so jurors would not hear it. The investigation moved swiftly. When Ritzer did not return home that evening, a search began. Blood found in an upstairs bathroom pointed officers to the school grounds where her body was discovered. Overnight, police encountered Chism walking along Route 1 in a neighboring town and took him into custody. Over the following months, prosecutors built a case from video physical evidence and witness accounts. A jury ultimately convicted him of murder in the first degree, aggravated rape, and armed robbery. The verdict rejected the defense claim that he lacked criminal responsibility. Sentencing balanced juvenile law with the gravity of the crimes. For the murder, he received life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years, but concurrent sentences for the sexual assault and robbery extended his first chance at parole to 40 years, placing any review far into middle age. In the years since the state's highest court has examined and affirmed the convictions and sentencing structure, ruling in 2025 that the trial judge acted within his discretion on contested expert evidence and that the jury's verdict stands. What explains the choice he made? The record suggests a convergence of grievance isolation and a narrowing mindset that transformed ordinary classroom interactions into perceived threats. Defense experts pointed to psychiatric symptoms. Prosecutors stressed planning, concealment, and purposeful actions. The court's outcomes reflect a consensus. Whatever pressures were present, they did not erase agency or accountability. Communities later learned he also pleaded guilty to a separate assault on a youth services clinician while in custody, reinforcing the picture of ongoing risk rather than a single break from character. The moral conclusion is clear and condemning. A beloved teacher whose family still organizes days of kindness in her honor was taken from her students and her town by a student she was trying to help. Explanations can inform prevention. Paying attention to isolation supporting families in transition and responding quickly to warning signs, but they cannot soften responsibility for violence. Remember Colleen Ritzer for her grace and dedication. Reject the act that ended her life and recommit to schools where disagreements are met with conversation support and vigilant safety, not harm. Justice in this case is measured not only by a sentence, but by a community's resolve to honor a teacher's legacy with compassion and unwavering protection for those who teach. 4. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. Eric David Harris and Dylan Bennett Klebold were seniors at Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado, teenagers who moved through the halls with the ordinary rhythms of late spring classes, cafeteria lines, and after-school plans. Harris, 18 years old, was the son of a retired Air Force pilot and a homemaker. He could be polite in class, meticulous with assignments, and outwardly composed. Inside his journals and online posts revealed contempt, grandiosity, and a fixation on power. Klebold, 17 years old, grew up in a supportive home with engaged parents, tall and soft-spoken, bright. In math and computers, prone to long stretches of quiet, friends remembered him as thoughtful, sometimes melancholy. The teacher who had become the day's most visible guardian was William Dave Sanders, 47 years old, a computer and business teacher and coach known for calm, steady leadership and an instinct to protect. In the months that led to the attack, threads of motive formed a dense and alarming web. Harris wrote about domination, and revenge tested small explosives and drew up lists. Many experts later described his pattern in terms consistent with psychopathy, calculated deception, lack of empathy, and a desire to control. Klebold's private writings tilted toward despair and suicidal ideation, a sense of alienation that darkened over time. Together, the pair created a feedback loop. Harris's appetite for spectacle and destruction met Klebold's hopelessness, and the result was not therapy or intervention, but planning. They acquired weapons, made crude bombs, filmed themselves, and framed the coming violence as a statement meant to shatter their school and their town. On the morning of Tuesday, April 20th, 1999, they moved from plans to action. Propane bombs were placed in the cafeteria and timed for the busiest lunch period. When those devices failed to explode, they shifted to guns and began firing outside the school before entering the building. In those first minutes, Dave Sanders was in the cafeteria. He immediately began moving students toward exits and up stairwells, waving them on and clearing paths. As the gunman advanced, he continued to warn others choosing to stand in their way so that teenagers could get out. He was struck by gunfire while urging students onward. Peers and a fellow teacher pulled him into a science classroom and tried to save him, writing a plea for help in the window that read in simple words, "One bleeding to death." Despite their courage and care, he died there, a teacher who had run toward danger to protect children. The attack unfolded in waves of panic and confusion. Students hid under tables, barricaded doors, and listened for footsteps. The gunmen roamed for less than an hour, killing students and terrorizing everyone inside. When they reached the library, they ended their own lives. The victims they left behind included a dozen students and one teacher, Dave Sanders. Many more were wounded. The scale of harm was devastating, and the shock rippled far beyond Colorado. Investigators pieced together the sequence through surveillance footage, dispatch logs, recovered journals, and tapes, and hundreds of interviews. Because the perpetrators died at the scene, there was no trials. Accountability lived in the public record and in the grief of families who faced memorials, funerals, and crowded hearings. Official reports and later analyses examined warning signs, failures in threat assessment, and the delayed medical rescue that could not reach Dave Sanders in time. The community's response centered on remembrance for the victims and a sober rethinking of school safety emergency protocols and mental health support. Psychologically, a broad consensus placed Harris as the principal driver, a planner whose writing and behavior reflected sadism and a hunger for domination, while Klebold appeared more depressive, impulsive, and self-destructive, drawn outward into violence by partnership. That contrast matters for prevention, but not for moral judgment. Both procured weapons, both made bombs, both chose a school as their target and pursued mass murder as a grim project. Claims about bullying or clique culture, sometimes exaggerated in early reporting, could not contain the evidence of premeditation and intent. What endures from that day is a double lesson of courage and condemnation. Dave Sanders' actions saved lives. Students and staff who followed his warnings survived to tell their stories. The community's resilience, the creation of scholarships, gardens, and days of service, and the insistence on remembering each person lost stand as a counterweight to the cruelty of the plan. At the same time, the moral verdict is unambiguous. Harris and Klebold attacked a place of learning with the purpose of killing indiscriminately. Whatever their inner struggles, nothing mitigates the decision to turn grievance nihilism or despair into violence. The story must close with clarity. We honor Dave Sanders and the students for courage under terror. We reject any narrative that elevates the perpetrators as anti-heroes. The charge to all of us is practical and ethical. Identify and address threats. Early build compassionate mental health systems, tighten access to deadly means, and train schools to move fast when seconds matter. Above all, keep the focus where it belongs on the victims, their families, in a community that refuses to let the worst act define its lasting legacy. 5. Mitchell Johnson and Andrew Golden. Mitchell Scott Johnson was 13 years old, and Andrew Douglas Golden was 11 classmates at Westside Middle School outside Jonesboro, Arkansas. From a distance, they looked like ordinary boys in a tight-knit rural community, riding the same bus, sharing the awkwardness of middle school, and moving through hallways where teachers knew families by name. Their paths crossed with Shannon Dawn Wright, a 32-year-old language arts teacher, described as patient, warm, and steady. She was a wife and a mother, known for guiding anxious readers through difficult chapters and for the way she stood in front of her students when trouble found them. In the months before the attack, fragments of motive gathered. Friends and classmates later told investigators that the boys had talked about getting even nursing grudges and fantasies of retaliation. Accounts point to a cocktail of adolescent anger, attention-seeking, and a desire to assert power. Reports also captured troubling behavior fights, fascination with guns, and for Johnson, threats toward an ex-girlfriend after a breakup. Nothing in those details excuses what followed. They do, however, outline a dangerous shift from idle talk to planning one that adults only fully recognized after the fact. On the afternoon of Tuesday, March 24th, 1998, the pair turned planning into action. One pulled a fire alarm to draw students and staff into the open. From a wooded area near the school, they opened fire with stolen firearms, aiming into a crowd that believed it was evacuating for safety. In those frantic seconds, Shannon Wright moved instinctively, placing herself between danger and a child. Witnesses would remember the chaos of a drill that was not a drill, the disbelief as pops echoed across brick and pavement, and a teacher's final act of protection. By the time police secured the scene, 4 students and 1 teacher, Wright, had been killed, and 10 others were wounded. The investigation unfolded with grim efficiency. Officers followed footprints, collected shell casings, and traced weapons to a relative's home. The boys had loaded a van with camping supplies, food, and multiple guns, signaling an intent to flee, but they were caught minutes after the shooting began. Their method alarm ambush attempt to escape was documented in official reports, survivor testimony, and later, retrospectives that tried to make sense of the senseless. Because of their ages, the legal outcome was constrained by Arkansas law. Tried as juveniles, they were found guilty of 5 murders and 10 assaults and committed to custody only until their 21st birthdays, the maximum penalty available then. The results sparked national debate about accountability in juvenile sentencing. Years later, the public record shows divergent paths. Mitchell Johnson was released in the mid-2000s and subsequently convicted in federal court for possessing a firearm while using marijuana, serving additional prison time. Andrew Golden, who later lived under the name Drew Grant, was denied a concealed carry permit and eventually died in a traffic crash more than 2 decades after the attack. Families of victims continued to speak at memorials and in interviews about lives interrupted and the enduring absence at dinner tables, graduations, and weddings. Psychologically, experts and journalists have described a blend of adolescent grievance and performative cruelty. The boys' actions suggest planning and resolve rather than a sudden loss of control, stolen weapons gathered in advance, an alarm used as a lure, a vantage point chosen for maximum exposure. Some accounts note depressive or angry rumination and an appetite for status through violence. Whatever the mix, the law and basic morality meet at the same conclusion. Agency was present, and responsibility is absolute. The last word belongs to clarity and to the people whose courage and loss define this story. Shannon Wright's final moments were spent shielding a child. Her students and fellow teachers remember her not for the way she died, but for the way she taught with patience, steadiness, and care. The attack was an assault on a community's trust on the promise that school is a safe place to learn and grow. We condemn the crimes without hesitation Explanations may inform prevention, listening for threats, securing firearms, and taking every warning seriously, but they can never soften accountability. Honor the victims by guarding classrooms, fiercely intervening early when grievance hardens into intent, and keeping the focus on compassion, vigilance, and justice. 6. Barrydale Loukaitis. Barrydale Loukaitis was a 14-year-old middle school student in Moses Lake, Washington, a quiet boy who drifted between classes in a small social circle while his home life unraveled. His parents were separating, and testimony later described a household tense with conflict and despair. Teachers remembered a student who could be distant and brooding. The educator whose name this story must honor is Leona Diane Carries, a 49-year-old algebra teacher wife and mother, known for patience at the board and the steady care she gave anxious learners in the year leading up to the crime warning signs accumulated. Mental health experts who evaluated Loukaitis described depressive symptoms, with some disagreement over diagnoses, while a prosecution psychiatrist emphasized a chronic low-grade mood disorder. Investigators and prosecutors also argued that he fed on violent cultural scripts pointing to the rock song Jeremy and to a Stephen King novel about a student who attacks his school. Whatever the precise mix, the picture that emerged was of an adolescent absorbing grievance fantasy and despair and turning them outward. None of these factors explain away what followed, but they help map a dangerous escalation from rumination to planning. On a Friday in early February of 1996, Loukaitis walked into Frontier Middle School dressed like a Wild West gunslinger. He carried a hunting rifle and 2 handguns and stepped into his 5th period algebra class. Within moments, he fired, killing 2 classmates and then fatally shooting his teacher, Leona Carries. He held the remaining students at gunpoint, threatening to take a hostage to escape. A gym coach, John Lane, entered, volunteered himself, and then seized the chance to tackle and disarm the shooter, ending the standoff and allowing students to flee. The facts are stark but need no graphic detail. A calculated entry, a brief burst of shots, a classroom held in terror, and a courageous intervention that stopped further harm. Police arrived to a scene already stabilized by staff. Investigators collected weapons and casings, reviewed witness statements, and traced the firearms to the family. The suspect subdued at the scene faced a raft of charges. Tried as an adult in Seattle to secure an impartial jury, he asserted an insanity defense that jurors rejected after hearing extensive testimony about his planning and state of mind. The court imposed 2 life terms plus more than 200 years a sentence that reflected the murders, the attempted murder of another student, and the kidnappings of the classmates he held at gunpoint. Decades later, national rulings on juvenile life without parole required new sentencing hearings for crimes committed by minors. In the spring of 2017, a judge in Grant County sentenced Loukaitis to 189 years. For the first time, he offered an apology in writing and in open court, acknowledging what he called a weak and senseless act. Survivors and families spoke about lives changed forever. A student who still struggled with lasting injuries, parents who woke each day to an empty room, colleagues who could still see their friend at the chalkboard. The new term left no practical path to release while complying with evolving law. What then motivated him? The record supports a convergence of depression, family turmoil, and fixation on violent narratives, pulled together by a desire to assert power in a place that should have been safe. Experts disagreed at the margins, but prosecutors and jurors saw planning, agency, and intent. In parallel, the remembrance of Leona Carries deepened. Colleagues and neighbors honored a teacher whose last moments in the classroom were spent protecting children, the kind of selfless instinct that defines the best of public education. The final word is condemnation and resolve. A teacher and 2 students were murdered, and a community's trust was shattered by a boy who chose violence. Explanations can guide prevention, supporting families in crisis, treating adolescent depression early, taking every threat seriously, and securing firearms, but they cannot soften responsibility. Remember Leona Carries for her grace and courage, and honor the survivors and families who live with the aftermath. The moral lesson is unambiguous. Schools must be sanctuaries, warning signs must be confronted, and those who attack classrooms must face full accountability under the law. 7. Nathaniel R. Brazill. Nathaniel R. Brazill was 13 years old, a 7th grade student in Lake Worth, Florida, when an ordinary school day became a tragedy that would define many lives. Teachers often described him as mild-mannered and likable. Classmates saw a boy who blended in. At home, however, accounts later pointed to instability and conflict that shaped his early years. The man whose life he took was Barry Grunow, an English teacher known for patience humor and steady care for students. In a detail that would haunt the community, Brazill had even called Grunow his favorite teacher. In the weeks and months before the shooting, pressures began to stack. On the last day of the school year, he was sent home for misbehavior involving water balloons, a teenage stunt that should have ended with a consequence and a conversation. Instead, a different sequence took hold. Investigators and journalists later described a boy fascinated by firearms, angry and embarrassed by discipline, and stewing in the kind of adolescent impulsivity that narrows options to a single terrible choice. None of these factors excuse what followed, but they help explain how a brief suspension and a troubled home life intersected with easy access to a gun. On a warm afternoon in late May of the year 2000, Brazill returned to Lake Worth Middle School with a small handgun. He walked to Barry Grunow's classroom and asked to speak with 2 girls. When the teacher declined, a single shot ended a devoted educator's life and fractured a community sense of safety. There's no need for graphic description. The facts themselves carry the weight. Students and staff froze in disbelief as the alarm spread through the halls. Within a short time, police had secured the campus and taken the 13-year-old into custody. The investigation moved quickly. Detectives traced the weapon to a family acquaintance and gathered statements from students and teachers who had seen the moments before and after the shooting. In the months that followed, prosecutors charged Brazill as an adult. A jury heard testimony about his conduct that day and about his mindset, including his taped statement claiming the gun fired accidentally. They rejected a first-degree charge, convicting him of second-degree murder and aggravated assault for pointing the weapon at another teacher. At sentencing, he apologized to the Grunow family. The judge imposed a term of 28 years in state prison, followed by additional supervision, a decision that reignited national debate about trying children as adults. Public response mixed grief with searching questions. Newsrooms and community forums examined the school's discipline that day, access to firearms, and the boundaries of Florida's sentencing laws for juveniles. Civil litigation by Barry Grunow's widow targeted the gun's manufacturer and others in the distribution chain, producing headlines and appeals that kept the case in view long after the criminal verdict. Over the years, remembrance shifted toward honoring the teacher's legacy through scholarships and memorials that emphasize service and compassion. Psychologically, experts and reporters sketched a picture of adolescent anger colliding with depression and family turmoil, then hardening into a plan. Defense narratives emphasized immaturity and accident. Prosecutors stressed agency choice and the deliberate decision to bring a loaded gun to school after a disciplinary incident. The jury's verdict and the court sentence reflect a clear conclusion. Whatever the pressures, responsibility remained with the young offender who turned a grievance into lethal action. Years later, Brazill remains incarcerated at a state correctional institution in Florida with a projected release in the late 2020s under the original term. From prison, he has at times expressed remorse and described efforts at education, but accountability for the harm endures. The people most affected are Barry Grunow's family, his students and colleagues, who lost a teacher devoted to their growth. The moral judgment here is unequivocal. A school must be a sanctuary where a teacher's authority is not to be met with violence. Explanations may guide prevention, listening to warning signs, securing firearms, and addressing youth mental health, but they will never soften the condemnation this crime deserves. We remember Barry Grunow for his kindness and craft, and we commit to protecting classrooms so that no community faces this loss again. 8. Deonte J. Green. Deonte J. Green was 16 years old, an Oklahoma teenager whose public face blended into ordinary city life until a single day revealed a pattern of choices that had been hardening out of sight. Friends and neighbors later described a young man who could be quiet and guarded moving through school and home routine without much notice. The educator, whose name must be honored, is Shane Anderson, a middle school social studies teacher, a husband and father, remembered by colleagues for creativity in the classroom and for the way he cared for students beyond the bell. In the period leading up to the crimes, court records and prosecutors sketched a troubling arc. Police contacts had accumulated over years, and by his mid-teens, Green's behavior was escalating from petty acts to serious offenses. Officials would later argue that this was not a single bad day, but the culmination of choices that grew bolder and more violent. Defense statements during sentencing framed a teenager who felt misunderstood. Those competing portraits set the stage for how a community would try to understand what happened next. On a fall weekend day in early October of the year 2017, a sequence of crimes unfolded across South Tulsa. An elderly couple was forced at gunpoint to drive to an ATM and hand over cash. The woman was later assaulted in her home. In the hours that followed, Green reached the Andersons' residence. Inside, he confronted the family. Shane Anderson moved to protect his loved ones. The confrontation ended in gunfire, and the teacher was killed in his own living room. These details are presented without graphic description. The method, the pace, and the setting carry all the weight required to understand the terror that day imposed on multiple homes. The investigation advanced quickly. Tulsa police traced the crime spree through victim statements, physical evidence, and a chain of robberies that linked incidents across the city. Broken Arrow Public Schools confirmed that the man who died was a geography teacher at Onetta Ridge Middle School, releasing a statement that began the public mourning. Within days, prosecutors charged Green as an adult with murder in the first degree and a long list of related felonies. A competency finding cleared the case for trial. Months later, he pleaded guilty, accepting responsibility across the docket. Sentencing came in midsummer of the year following the plea. A Tulsa County judge imposed life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of Shane Anderson, plus an additional term measured in centuries for the assaults and robberies, ensuring no realistic release. In court, the judge cited the rare legal finding that the defendant was permanently incorrigible, a threshold required to impose life without parole on a person who was a juvenile at the time of the crime. The teacher's widow spoke with grace and grief, expressing relief that justice recognized the harm while reminding the courtroom that no sentence could return her husband. What do the facts suggest about psychology and motive? Prosecutors emphasized long-running delinquency, thrill-seeking, and a willingness to dominate vulnerable people, arguing that the crimes were opportunistic but not impulsive. Defense comments described a boy who felt unseen and insisted he was not a monster. The court's conclusions and the pattern established by the day's events pointed to agency and escalation rather than to a temporary break from character. The teacher's final moments, by contrast, reflect a different kind of choice, a husband and father stepping forward to defend his family. This story must close with moral clarity. A beloved educator lost his life at home, and multiple victims across the city endured crimes that no community should face. Understanding risk factors can guide prevention, swift intervention when youth behavior escalates, strong support for victims, careful attention to firearms access, and services that meet families where they are, but explanation is not absolution. The legal outcome recognizes that some acts chosen freely and repeated across a single day forfeit the privilege of release. We remember Shane Anderson for his devotion to students and his courage in defense of his family. We condemn the crimes without hesitation and commit to the practical work of safety, accountability, and care for those left behind. 9. Gary Pennington. Gary Scott Pennington was a 17-year-old high school senior at East Carter High School in Grayson, Kentucky, known as a bright, bookish student who excelled in academics and often kept to himself. He grew up in a family facing financial strain, and teachers saw a teenager whose intellect could shine even as his social world seemed narrow. The educator, at the center of this tragedy, was Deanna McDavid, a 48-year-old English teacher remembered as demanding but deeply caring, the sort who pushed students to think clearly and treated literature as a path toward character. The school's head custodian, Marvin Hicks, was a fixture of kindness on campus, quick, with a helping hand, and a friendly word. In the months before the crime, classmates and later reporting described Pennington as a high-achieving but troubled teen who had grown fixated on perceived slights and pressures. Local coverage and a later scholarly analysis pointed to themes of shame, depression, and simmering anger factors that, while never an excuse, outline a young person struggling to regulate emotion and to accept ordinary academic setbacks. Some accounts said he was upset about a grade in English and that grievance joined a private storm already brewing. On an afternoon in mid-January of 1993, during 7th period, English Pennington brought a concealed revolver into Mrs. McDavid's classroom. In front of stunned students, he fired, killing their teacher. When Marvin Hicks rushed in after hearing the commotion, Pennington fatally shot him as well. For a short time, he kept classmates in the room, counting rounds and speaking in a way that suggested he might harm more people, then began letting students leave in pairs. He soon surrendered in the hallway to responding officers. These facts are offered without graphic detail. The method, the setting, and the sequence are sober and sufficient. Detectives secured the scene, collected the weapon, and took statements from terrified teenagers who had just watched the unthinkable. In the days that followed, the small town absorbed the grief of losing a beloved teacher and a familiar custodian. The case moved quickly through the courts. Pennington was certified to stand trial as an adult. Ultimately, he entered a plea of guilty but mentally ill to murder and related charges. A judge imposed life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years, reflecting Kentucky law for juveniles at the time. Years later, while incarcerated, Pennington assaulted a prison worker and received an additional 20 years of development that kept him behind bars even as he approached parole eligibility under the original sentence. As of recent reports, he remains incarcerated. What emerges from the psychological record is a convergence of high intellect isolation and unmanaged distress. The academic literature on the case discusses shame and depressive patterns. Contemporaneous reporting highlights anger over a classroom grade. Prosecutors and investigators emphasized planning agency and the deliberate decision to carry a loaded firearm into school. Defense arguments about mental illness did not erase accountability. The guilty but mentally ill verdict acknowledged treatment needs while affirming criminal responsibility. The final measure of this story belongs to the victims and to a community that still bears the scar. Colleagues remembered Deanna McDavid as a disciplined, generous teacher who expected excellence and offered help to get there. Students recalled Marvin Hicks as the steady guardian of their hallways. The survivors who sat in that room speak of anniversaries that reopen wounds and of ordinary sounds, lockers' loud pops, a slamming door that can still trigger fear. Explanations may guide prevention from supporting students' mental health to responding quickly to threats and limiting access to firearms. But explanation is not absolution. This crime was a conscious decision that destroyed 2 lives and reshaped many others. Let the closing word be clear, and condemning schools must be sanctuaries. Educators and staff deserve unwavering protection, and when violence steals them from their classrooms, justice demands accountability and remembrance that never turns perpetrators into protagonists. 10. Eric Houston. Eric Christopher Houston was 20 years old, a former student who had failed to graduate from Lyndhurst High School in Olivehurst, California. Classmates and teachers once knew him as quiet and withdrawn, a young man who drifted at the edges of campus life. The educator tied to his return was Robert Brenz, a 41-year-old civics teacher regarded as firm fare and devoted to students. In the public imagination, that spring one was a disaffected dropout, the other a trusted mentor whose classroom symbolized order and civics itself. What pushed Houston from grievance to violence was, by investigators' accounts, a fixated sense of humiliation. Officials said he blamed Brenz and a failing grade for derailing his graduation, and he carried that resentment for years. This was not a sudden break, but a grievance rehearsed in private until it hardened into intent. Later proceedings would show no legal finding of insanity to erase responsibility. A jury found him sane after a dedicated sanity phase. On a warm Friday in early May of 1992, Houston walked onto campus carrying a rifle and a shotgun. He entered Brenz's classroom and opened fire, killing the teacher. As panic spread, he moved through the building and began a prolonged hostage siege that stretched through the afternoon into the night. By the time he surrendered, 3 students were dead, and many others were wounded, with dozens of terrified hostages released in stages as negotiators worked to de-escalate the crisis. The span of fear measured roughly 8 hours, marked by tense exchanges, small concessions, and desperate acts of survival. The investigation unfolded in real time. Sheriff's deputies and negotiators mapped the hallways, tracked phone calls, and worked witnesses even as students hid in or were escorted out. Contemporary reports captured the rhythm of the standoff, including the negotiations that led to partial releases of hostages. When Houston finally laid down his weapons, officers secured the scene, gathered ballistic evidence, and began interviewing survivors who had watched their school transformed into a battleground. Prosecutors charged Houston with multiple counts of murder and attempted murder, as well as hostage-taking. A Yuba County jury convicted him of murder in the first degree for the deaths of Robert Brenz and 3 students, and returned a verdict of death after the penalty phase. Years later, the California Supreme Court affirmed his convictions and sentence, rejecting a slate of appellate claims. Today, he remains under a death sentence in California, with appeals and collateral challenges surfacing periodically in the courts. For the community, the human cost came into focus in the days that followed. Teachers wept in interviews about a colleague who had given his career to public service. Students spoke of split-second choices of hiding and whispering prayers, and of the impossibility of ever seeing their hallways the same way again. Memorials named each person lost, and survivors returned to class under the weight of empty desks and unanswered questions. Local coverage on anniversaries has kept those voices alive, a reminder that trauma lingers long after satellite trucks leave town. What explains Houston's choices? The record points to revenge, shaped by wounded pride and a desire to reclaim control over a story he felt had slipped away. It was not a cry for help broadcast in advance, but a plan executed with weapons and a willingness to hold children hostage to his grievance. The sanity verdict and the appellate decisions underscore a legal consensus. Whatever the private turmoil agency was present, and responsibility is absolute. The closing truth must be stated plainly. A teacher who taught the rules of citizenship died in his classroom. 3 students never went home. Many others carry scars, seen and unseen. Explanations may inform prevention, spotting fixated grievances, responding to threats, and securing school corridors. But explanation is not absolution. We honor Robert Brenz and the students by insisting that schools remain sanctuaries, by supporting survivors, and by refusing to romanticize a killer whose choices shattered a community.